predicting 30% penetration of society by mobile telephony were dismissed as being hopelessly optimistic. Okay? Cellular has been consistently underestimated. Computers also have been consistently underestimated in history. Okay? So it's not always that people tend to be too optimistic. Okay? Another example, this is from 10 years ago. Okay? At a conference on the web, there was one particular paper presented at this conference in Australia talking about search, web search. Okay? And the author said that the goals of the advertising business model do not always correspond to providing quality search to users. We expect that advertising-funded search engines will be inherently biased towards the advertisers and away from the needs of the consumers. We believe the issue of advertising causes enough mixed incentives that it is crucial to have a competitive search engine that is transparent and in the academic realm. Of course, we know the great success of recent years in the high-tech arena is Google, which has a search engine which is not in the academic realm, which is anything but transparent, okay, and supported by advertising. Okay? So you might think that the authors of this passage, they probably shorted Google stock on its IPO and are bankrupt today. Well, if you thought so, you would be wrong, okay? Because the authors happen to be Sergey Brin and Larry Page. Okay? Which shows you that you can actually be wrong and also be very successful. And this is not anything new, particular. This was also true, for example, in this period I'll be talking about of early railways. I mean, there was a number of instances where the importance of the value of railways was misunderstood. Okay? In particular, the railways were really developed for freight transport, primarily to deal with relatively short-haul transport of coal. The overwhelming majority, and it was also, of course, transport over short distances at low speeds, okay? And the issue was low cost. Turns out the overwhelming majority of the revenues of early railroads in Britain, US was different, I'm talking just of Britain here, in Britain came from passengers who cared more about speed than about low cost. Okay? So all those early railway visionaries, they were wrong, but they were right. It was sort of in the right direction, but not quite, etc. Okay? Some of them went bankrupt too, some were very successful. But again, very few people had precisely the right idea of the way the industry was going to develop. And I can go probably for a full hour just telling you about various misconceptions that animated many of the early developers. Okay? So technology prediction is hard. Okay? Now, something else, though, and since in some cases you can make some predictions, I mentioned occasionally you can tell that out of 1,000 sacks of gold, supposed gold dust, at most 100 will be genuine because you have a hard objective measure. Okay? But there is this mass kind of a collective hallucination in the society, so-called efficient markets theory, which claims that doesn't happen. And our current chairman of the Federal Reserve is a prominent proponent of that theory. One of his more famous papers, was 10 years ago, claimed that advocates of bubbles would probably be forced to admit that it is difficult or impossible to identify any particular episode conclusively as a bubble, even after the fact. And this is presumably what predisposed him not to be able to identify the real estate bubble or the credit bubble or other things. I hope he knows how to handle the panic that's now developing, etc. But one of the main points of the presentation is that that's false. Okay? That actually the internet bubble and the British railway mania provided examples where indeed there was evidence to beforehand, before the bubble, to show that it was going to burst. With poor kind of outcomes. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about the British railway mania and also talk about sizes and comparing it to the internet bubble. So here is a chart. This shows authorizations for construction of railways by British Parliament. Okay? This is in miles, authorized each year. So in those days, you didn't just build a railway. Okay, you had to get right of use, permission to use right of eminent domain to acquire land. Okay, and so he had to go to Parliament. This is all about Britain. I mean, American experience was different. Again, I can talk for hours on that one. Here I'm just talking about British experience. Here's British experience of the 1830s and 1840s. You see there was a blip, which wasn't actually so small, in the mid-1830s, and then there is this big blip in the late 1840s. Okay? And by 1850, okay, people are really, really sorry. Okay, they got those also authorization and they built those lines. Nobody wants to touch new railways with 10-foot pole. I mean, they've lost so much money, they are so disgusted in that case. Okay? And I'll talk about just how much money they lost in a second. Here is something similar, US telecom industry. So this is capital spending, CapEx, in just US telecom industry. So that was Britain, here is just US, not worldwide, etc. Basically, you look in the mid-late 1990s, it was running at about $35–40 billion per year, roughly 15% of revenues. That's very typical for telecom. Then it spiked up to well over 30% of revenues, peak around year 2000, and then subsided back to the old traditional level to these days. Okay. So this is a little bit different. It's not a brand new technology. Yes, internet is new, but telecom is not. And in fact, internet could exist largely because of the infrastructure provided by voice telephony service in that case. But there was this big spike, and you look at how much money was spent above the trend line. So instead of looking at total capital expenditure by telecom industry during that period, just look what's about what would have been spent if you just spent 15%. Roughly level, it comes to about $150 billion over a period of, say, 5 years. Okay? How do we compare these bubbles? Turns out there's absolutely no comparison in terms of sizes. Okay? In the case of the British railway mania, what they spent, well, this is both during the 1830s and 1840s. I'll talk about the division of the two periods. They spent about £200 million sterling, which relative to the size of the economy is about 40% of GDP. That's about $6 trillion today. You go to Wall Street and tell them you want to invest in something that will take $6 trillion, they'll have you locked up. It would be totally crazy. Okay? So I mentioned US telecom bubble involved about 1.5% of GDP in this period. Okay? Just absolutely huge disparity. Something else, I was pretty careful in talking about the bubble and how it was going to burst. I was talking about telecom bubble. So the internet bubble, internet mania, consisted of two main components. One was a telecom bubble, roughly $150 billion, and there was a dot-com bubble. And the dot-com bubble, in terms of capital expenditure, was actually tiny. In terms of stock market valuation, it's a different story, which again I will allude to at the end, kind of talk about the changing nature of the economy, etc. But in terms of the actual capex, it was tiny. Some of my best friends helped found and are employed by Akamai. Akamai is this content distribution network. It's one of these kind of dot-coms, mostly in telecom sector, that has survived a crash and is doing pretty well. Okay? It did its IPO back in 99 or 2000, I forget when. At that peak, it was valued at about $35 billion. When the nuclear winter descended 2002, 2003, its valuation dropped down to about $70 million. Okay? More recently, it spiked up to about $5 billion, and right now it's around $3 billion or so. It's profitable. It looks like it's sustainable. It provides real services. I mean, it has is contributing to the efficiency of the economy, etc. But when what was valued at $35 billion, the actual investment in it, the amount of money that was paid for the servers, for the software developers, for bandwidth, etc., that didn't even amount to $350 million. Okay? So basically you had this huge disparity between stock market valuations reflecting this collective hallucination that kind of possessed all the kind of investors in that case and the underlying kind of concrete reality. Something smaller happened in Britain, but it was giant. It was this giant phenomenon, 40% of GDP. I mean, I'll spend a few minutes, but it's really hard for me to even understand, much less kind of explain how it could have happened. This was the only period in modern European history, going back for some centuries, I've been able to find where individual capitalists, in pursuit of private profit, put more money into building a public infrastructure than the nation was putting into military. Okay? And British military spending as that period was not that cheap. Pax Britannica was not cheap. The spending was running up to 4% of GDP, roughly what it is for the United States today. Okay? At the peaks of spending, say 1847, individual British capitalists were pouring about twice as much into building railways. Still fairly primitive society, beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, etc., but making this huge exertion. Okay? The army of people who were working on railways was more than twice as big as the British Army and Navy put together in terms of manpower. So again, different societies, etc., but comparing to size of the working population, different organizations and say armed forces, think of an army of 5 million laborers out there doing digging all these ditches, embankments, tunnels, and other things, constructing a totally new infrastructure. Okay, and it had huge effect. It involved just about everybody. Okay, Charles Darwin got involved as an investor. Bronte sisters, the novelists and poets, got involved in it. Thackeray got involved in it. Talk about any of the famous politicians or statesmen. Gladstone and his family were up to their necks in it. Palmerston was in it. Disraeli was in it. Peel was in it. Just about everybody was in it. Okay? It was really giant. Okay? Why? Well, again, because it was relieving a really pressing need. Transportation was a real bottleneck. Okay? When you go to venture capitalists today with a brand new idea, some technological solution, usually one of the first questions they ask you, what itch are you scratching? So, why would somebody care about your invention? What will it do for them? Okay? Well, in the case of the British economy or any other economy, by the way, when I talk about this spending of 8% of GDP in 1 year on railway investment, this giant phenomenon, so this was kind of peak of the mania in that case. During all of the 19th century, huge amounts were being invested. In both Britain and United States, in the second half of the 19th century, it was routine to invest 1 to 2% of GDP, okay, in railways. So remember, total investment, kind of excess investment in telecom during our internet bubble was 1.5% of GDP. Okay? But during this period, 120 years ago, the country routinely invested 1 to 2%. And it was a really, really pressing need to develop the transportation infrastructure. I mean, in some sense, again, I can't quite think of a big, transportation was this really, it wasn't an itch, it was a searing pain that all the kind of merchants, all the population really felt very strongly. Transporting coal, say 15 miles from coal mine to population, doubled the price. Okay? And coal, of course, was necessary. Country was already kind of deforested, etc. You can still think of it, in today's environment. Suppose that somebody came up with something like a Star Trek transporter. You step onto a stage, fraction of a second later you're in Beijing or Moscow or wherever it is. Okay, effortless transportation. Okay, would be wonderful, right? But now suppose that somebody came up with a Star Trek transporter, except each of these installations, instead of being this little tiny thing that's on the deck of the Enterprise, instead what it requires is taking a plot of land half a mile across, digging something deep, half a mile deep, installing some very expensive equipment, $100 billion a pop. Okay? Would you want to invest in it? Well, the Brits did. And the Americans to some extent too, on a smaller scale. It was a really, really big event. Okay? Huge investment. Okay? And by the way, this is not something I've discovered. I mean, this is pretty well documented. So, this is an aside. There is very little known about the British Railway Mania. There's not a single decent book that studies it. So I really have great fun, playing with it. Some parts of it have been, studied, have been documented very well, but there's not a single good book about that period. I hope to kind of help remedy that gap. And this is very surprising. There are lots of books about the Dutch Tullock Mania, lots of books about South Sea Bubble, lots of books about the French South, French Louisiana, Mississippi company, and so on, but nothing about the railway.